The water was brown, not the clean brown of creek beds after a gentle rain, but the churning, angry brown of a river that had swallowed too much too fast. It carried branches, debris, and mud in a roiling current that looked more like boiling coffee than anything meant to sustain life. The Brazos River, normally lazy and predictable through the heart of McLennan County, Texas, had transformed overnight into something vicious. It was late afternoon in June of 1944. The sun hung heavy and brutal in a sky bleached almost white by heat. Cicadas screamed from the mesquite trees. The air itself felt thick, pressing down on everything like a wet wool blanket. For 3 days straight, storms had pounded central Texas, turning roads to soup and rivers to monsters. Now, in the brief respite between weather systems, the land steamed under merciless sun while the Brazos raged on, swollen to twice its normal width. Near the river's edge, a work detail of German prisoners of war labored in the heat. 12 men in faded uniforms, their shirts dark with sweat, their faces burned red despite months under the Texas sun. They were repairing fence lines damaged by flooding, hauling posts and wire under the watchful eyes of 2 American guards who leaned against a truck in whatever shade they could find. The work was hard but familiar. Most of these men had grown up on farms in Bavaria or Prussia. They knew fence work, understood the logic of it, the necessity. Among them was Heinrich Vorbs, 26 years old, captured in Tunisia over a year ago. He had been a radio operator in Rommel's Africa Corps, had survived sandstorms and tank battles and the slow collapse of the North African campaign. He had expected to die when the British surrounded his unit. Instead, he'd been shipped across an ocean to a place that still didn't feel entirely real. Texas. The word itself had sounded like fiction back in Germany, something from Karl May novels about the Wild West. Now he lived it daily, mending fences and herding cattle on a ranch outside Waco, sleeping in a POW camp where the guards said please, and the meals included meat. Heinrich drove another post into the soft earth, the wooden mallet heavy in his hands. His back ached, his shoulders burned, but the pain was clean, honest. It was work, nothing more, not war, not death, just labor under an unforgiving sun. He had learned to find peace in that simplicity. Then he heard the scream. It was high-pitched, terrified, and brief, the kind of sound that turns blood to ice. Heinrich's head snapped up. 50 yards away, near a bend in the river where the current funneled between 2 banks, a small figure thrashed in the brown water. A child. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, his arms flailing as the current dragged him downstream. For one frozen second, Heinrich couldn't process what he was seeing. Then, his mind caught up with his eyes. The boy had been playing too close to the edge. The bank, softened by days of rain, had given way beneath him. Now the Brazos had him, and it wasn't letting go. Heinrich dropped the mallet. He didn't think. Thinking would have stopped him. Thinking would have reminded him that he was a prisoner, that leaving the work detail without permission could get him shot, that the current was strong enough to kill a grown man, let alone pull a drowning child to safety. Thinking would have paralyzed him with all the reasons not to act. So he didn't think. He ran. His boots pounded against mud and grass. Behind him, someone shouted. He didn't turn to see who. The river grew louder as he closed the distance, the sound of it like a freight train that never stopped. The boy went under. Came up. Went under again. His small arms were weakening, the fight draining out of him with each second. Heinrich hit the water at a full sprint, the cold shock of it stealing his breath, even though the air was 95 degrees. The current grabbed him immediately, powerful and indifferent, pulling him sideways even as he pushed forward. The bottom disappeared beneath his feet. He was swimming now, fighting the river with every stroke, his eyes locked on the spot where the boy had gone under. There. A flash of pale skin, a small hand breaking the surface. Heinrich lunged, his fingers closing around fabric. The boy's shirt. He pulled, dragging the child toward him, even as the current tried to rip them both downstream. The boy was limp, heavy with water and terror. Heinrich wrapped one arm around the small chest and turned toward the bank, kicking hard, his free arm pulling against the current. It was like swimming through concrete. Every foot gained was a battle. The river wanted them. It pulled and twisted, trying to tumble them under. Heinrich's lungs burned, his muscles screamed. The bank seemed impossibly far away, and for a moment he wondered if they would both drown here, tangled together in brown water while the Texas sun beat down without mercy. But then his foot touched bottom. Then his knee scraped rock. He pushed up, staggering, still clutching the boy. 3 more steps and they were in the shallows. 2 more and he collapsed on the muddy bank, the child's weight on top of him, both of them coughing and gasping. The boy vomited river water. His small body convulsed, choking and heaving. Heinrich rolled him onto his side, supporting him with shaking hands. The child's eyes were open, wide and terrified, but alive, conscious, breathing. Heinrich stayed on his knees in the mud, his own breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his skull. Around him, the world came back into focus, the screaming cicadas, the smell of wet earth, and silence. Complete, terrible silence. He looked up. The entire work detail had stopped. Every prisoner stood frozen, tools in hand, staring. The 2 guards had pushed off from the truck, their rifles held across their chests, their faces unreadable. And, running toward them, boots kicking up mud, face white as death, was a man Heinrich recognized, Jack Davenport, the ranch foreman, the boy's father. Jack dropped to his knees beside his son, his hands hovering over the child as if afraid to touch him, afraid he might break or disappear. The boy coughed again, more water coming up, and then his small voice, weak and trembling. "Daddy." Jack Davenport pulled his son into his arms and held him so tight it seemed he might never let go. His shoulders shook, his face pressed into the boy's wet hair. No words came, only the sound of a father's relief too profound for language. For a long moment, the only sounds were the boy's ragged breathing and the endless rush of the river that had nearly claimed him. Then Jack looked up at Heinrich. Their eyes met, blue eyes staring into brown. An American father and a German prisoner, enemy and enemy, except that word had just lost all meaning. Jack's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse and breaking. "You saved him." Heinrich didn't know what to say. His English was limited, learned in pieces from cowboys and guards over months of captivity. He managed 3 words, his accent thick. He was drowning. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't heroism. It was simply the truth. The boy was drowning. So Heinrich had jumped in. There was nothing else to do, no other choice that made sense. Jack stood slowly, his son still clinging to him, small arms wrapped around his father's neck. The foreman was a tall man, weathered and strong from decades of ranch work. He looked at Heinrich the way you might look at something impossible, something that shouldn't exist but does anyway. Then, with his free hand, the one not supporting his child, Jack Davenport reached out and gripped Heinrich's shoulder. The gesture was firm, almost painful in its intensity. "I don't care what uniform you wore. I don't care what army you fought for. You gave me back my son. You hear me? You gave me back my boy." Heinrich nodded, unable to speak. The weight of the moment was crushing. He had saved a life, his enemy's life, a child's life. And now the child's father stood before him, tears streaming down his face, gratitude and confusion and something like wonder mixing in his expression. One of the guards finally moved, walking over with careful steps. He was young, maybe 22, a farm boy from Oklahoma who'd been assigned to guard duty because of a bum knee that kept him out of combat. His name was Private Miller, and his hands were shaking slightly as he lowered his rifle. "Sir," he said to Jack, voice uncertain. "Sir, he left the work detail. He ain't supposed to—" Jack turned to look at the guard, and whatever Miller saw in the foreman's face made him stop talking immediately. "This man just saved my son's life," Jack said quietly, each word precise and deliberate. "You want to tell me about what he's supposed to do? You do it later. Right now, you let him be." Miller nodded quickly, stepping back. The other guard hadn't moved at all, just watched the whole scene with wide eyes. Jack looked back at Heinrich. His son had stopped coughing, was breathing more easily now, his small face pressed against his father's shoulder. "What's your name?" "Heinrich Vorbs. Heinrich managed. He was still kneeling in the mud, his uniform soaked through, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving behind trembling muscles and a bone-deep fatigue. Heinrich, Jack repeated, testing the name on his tongue. Heinrich, I owe you everything. You understand that? Everything I got that matters, you just pulled out of that river. Heinrich didn't know how to respond to that. In the German army, you followed orders, you did your duty. Acts of heroism were expected, demanded, commanded, but this hadn't been any of those things. This had been instinct, humanity. The simple, undeniable truth that you don't let children drown when you can stop it. War or no war. Enemy or no enemy. Jack shifted his son's weight, looked around at the watching men, prisoners, and guards alike, all of them caught in the strange suspension of this moment. Then he looked back at Heinrich, and his voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. I won't forget this. My family won't forget this. This town won't forget this. Heinrich didn't understand then what those words would mean. Couldn't imagine how that single moment in the mud beside a swollen river would reshape not just his life, but the lives of everyone watching. How it would spark something that would spread through the community like fire through dry grass. How an act of simple humanity would become something bigger, something that challenged everything people thought they knew about enemies and allies, about Germans and Americans, about who deserved mercy and who didn't. All Heinrich knew, kneeling there in his soaked uniform with river mud on his hands, was that a boy was breathing who might have stopped breathing. That was enough. It had to be enough. Jack Davenport carried his son toward the truck, calling back to one of the guards to drive them to the doctor in town. The boy needed checking, needed dry clothes and warm blankets, and probably his mother's arms around him for the rest of the day. As they disappeared into the truck, the child looked back over his father's shoulder. His eyes found Heinrich, and slowly, weakly, the boy raised one small hand in a wave. Heinrich waved back. His hand was still shaking. The work detail resumed slowly, awkwardly, everyone moving like they'd just witnessed something they didn't quite have words for. Heinrich picked up his mallet, drove another post into the ground. But everything had changed. He could feel it in the way the other prisoners looked at him, a mixture of awe and concern. He could feel it in the way the guards stood differently, their rifles somehow less threatening. He could feel it in his own chest, where his heart was finally starting to slow back to its normal rhythm. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon. The Brazos continued its rage, brown water churning past without care for what had almost happened on its banks. And Heinrich Vorbs, prisoner of war, enemy soldier, foreigner in a foreign land, went back to work on a fence that would keep cattle from wandering too close to a river that had nearly claimed a child's life. He didn't know it yet, but that river had changed more than its course in the last 3 days of rain. It had changed the current of history, at least for a small community in central Texas. Because in 1944, in the middle of a world war with millions dying across oceans, one German prisoner had made a choice that would force an entire town to make a choice of their own. What do you do when your enemy proves himself more human than you ever imagined? That night, back in the barracks at Camp McLennan, Heinrich lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. His muscles ached from the cold shock of the river, from fighting the current, from the bone-deep exhaustion that follows terror and adrenaline. Around him, the other prisoners whispered in German, their voices low and wondering. Some asked questions he couldn't answer. Why did you do it? What made you jump? Others simply stared at him like he'd done something incomprehensible, something that didn't fit within the rules they'd all learned to live by. He didn't have answers for them. He barely had answers for himself. All he knew was that when he'd seen that small body in the water, every other consideration had vanished. The war, the uniform, the fence between enemy and enemy. None of it had mattered. Only the drowning child mattered. Only the seconds ticking away before it would be too late. But to understand why Heinrich Vorbs made that choice, why he dove into a river that could have killed him to save the son of a man whose country was at war with his own, you have to go back. Back to the beginning of his journey to Texas. Back to the moment his war ended and his captivity began. Tunisia, May of 1943. The North African campaign was collapsing. Rommel's Afrika Korps, once the terror of the desert, was being crushed between British forces pushing from the east and American forces driving from the west. Heinrich had spent 3 years in that desert, operating radio equipment, coordinating communications between tank units, watching the sand swallow men and machines with equal indifference. He'd survived Tobruk, El Alamein, and a dozen smaller battles whose names he could barely remember. But by May of 1943, survival meant something different. It meant surrender. His unit was surrounded near Cap Bon, the northeastern tip of Tunisia. They were out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of hope. When the British tanks rolled up, Heinrich and his fellow soldiers raised their hands. It was over, just like that. 3 years of war ending in a moment of silence and raised palms. Some men wept, others looked relieved. Heinrich felt nothing but a strange emptiness, like he'd been holding his breath for years and had finally been allowed to exhale. The British processed them quickly, efficiently, thousands upon thousands of German and Italian soldiers, all captured in the final weeks of the North African campaign. They were searched, catalogued, and loaded onto trucks that took them to makeshift camps near the coast. Then came the ships. Heinrich expected to be taken to England, perhaps to a prisoner of war camp somewhere in the British countryside. Instead, the rumors spread through the crowded holds of transport vessels. They were being sent across the Atlantic to America. The news filled most prisoners with dread. America. Nazi propaganda had painted a specific picture of that place, a nation of mongrels and criminals where chaos reigned and human life had no value. They'd been told that Americans treated prisoners worse than animals, that torture and execution awaited anyone captured by forces from the New World. Heinrich had seen the posters in barracks back in Germany, the cartoons of brutish American soldiers with exaggerated features, the warnings about what would happen to good German boys who fell into enemy hands. He'd never quite believed it all. The propaganda was too obviously exaggerated, too cartoonish. But fear doesn't need truth to take root. As the ship cut through Atlantic waters, crowded with prisoners and fear, Heinrich wondered if he would ever see Germany again. The journey took weeks. Men were sick constantly, the ship pitching through rough seas, the holds thick with the smell of vomit and unwashed bodies. Some prayed, others sang quietly, old songs from home, melodies that reminded them of villages and families they might never see again. Heinrich mostly stayed silent, conserving his strength, trying not to think about what awaited them on the far shore. When they finally reached the port of Norfolk, Virginia, in late June of 1943, Heinrich's first sight of America was industrial and overwhelming. Massive cranes, ships being built and launched at impossible speed, warehouses stretching as far as he could see, and abundance. That was the word that stuck in his mind. Abundance. Everything looked new, functional, endless. The docks weren't bomb-damaged. The buildings stood intact. There were no ruins, no signs of war's destruction. It was as if the conflict consuming Europe and Africa existed in another universe entirely. They were loaded onto trains, passenger cars with barred windows, and began another journey. This one took them south and west, through landscapes Heinrich had only seen in films. Green forests giving way to red clay hills, cotton fields stretching to the horizon, small towns where American children played in yards and waved at the passing train without fear. Heinrich pressed his face to the window, unable to reconcile what he saw with what he'd been told. Where was the chaos? Where was the poverty? Where were the suffering masses ground down by capitalist greed? After days of travel, the train stopped in central Texas, near the city of Waco. The prisoners were marched off and trucked to Camp McLennan, one of dozens of POW camps being constructed across the state. Texas, they learned, was to be their home for the duration of the war. Nearly 50,000 German prisoners would eventually be housed across the Lone Star State, held in facilities ranging from massive compounds like Camp Hearn and Camp Swift to smaller branch camps scattered across ranches and farmland. Heinrich's first impression of Camp McLennan was surprise. Yes, there were guard towers. Yes, there were fences topped with barbed wire. But the barracks were solid, the facilities clean. They were issued blankets, toiletries, and clean uniforms. The camp had a mess hall, an infirmary, even a small library. When Heinrich stood in line for his first meal on American soil, he stared at what was placed before him. Meat, real meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread with butter, more food than he'd seen on a single plate in months. Around him, other prisoners ate in stunned silence, unable to process the paradox. They were captives, enemies, yet they were being fed better than they'd eaten at the front. An older prisoner, a sergeant named Klaus who'd been captured in Sicily, leaned over and whispered, "They feed us the same rations as American troops, 3,200 calories a day." I heard the guards talking. "It's the Geneva Convention. They have to treat us properly." Heinrich had heard of the Geneva Convention, the international agreements governing treatment of prisoners of war. But hearing about rules and experiencing them were different things entirely. In the German army, you followed orders or faced consequences. Mercy was weakness, compassion was suspect. Yet here, the Americans seemed to follow these international laws almost obsessively, as if the rules mattered more than hatred, more than revenge. The days fell into routine. Morning roll call, work assignments, labor details. The United States was facing a massive shortage of workers. Millions of American men were overseas fighting, and the farms and ranches that fed the nation were desperate for hands. Congress had authorized prisoner labor, and the Army had struck agreements with local farmers and ranchers. Prisoners could be hired out for agricultural work, with wages paid to the U.S. government. In exchange, POWs received small credits they could use in camp canteens for cigarettes, candy, or toiletries. Heinrich was assigned to a ranch work detail in early August of 1943. He and 11 other prisoners were trucked out each morning to the Davenport Ranch, one of the larger cattle operations in McLennan County. Their supervisor was Jack Davenport, the foreman, a man in his mid-30s with sun-weathered skin and a quiet authority that didn't require shouting. He explained through a translator what needed to be done. Fences needed mending, cattle needed tending, hay needed moving. Simple work for anyone who'd grown up on a farm. Heinrich had grown up on a farm. His family had a small property outside Hanover, where they'd raised dairy cows and grown vegetables. The work here was familiar, almost comforting in its simplicity. There were no bombs, no gunfire, no fear of death from above. Just labor under the Texas sun, honest work that left you tired but not traumatized. But the cultural shock went deeper than just work. The cowboys themselves were a revelation. Heinrich had expected stern military men, rigid and harsh. Instead, he found ranchers who wore wide-brimmed hats and spoke with slow drawls, who measured a man by how well he worked rather than what uniform he'd worn. They were practical, efficient, and surprisingly friendly once they saw that the German prisoners weren't the fanatics Nazi propaganda had made them out to be. The first time a cowboy offered Heinrich water from his own canteen, sharing it casually like it was nothing, Heinrich almost refused out of pure confusion. Enemies didn't share water, captors didn't show kindness to captives. But the cowboy, a man named Robert who was too old for the draft, just shrugged and said something in English Heinrich didn't fully understand. The translator, a bilingual prisoner named Otto, explained. "He says we're all just men trying to get through the day. Might as well be decent about it." Decent. That word kept appearing. The Americans seemed almost obsessed with being decent, with following rules, with treating even their enemies fairly. It baffled Heinrich at first, then slowly began to reshape how he understood the war. Back home, they'd been told Americans were soft, weak, incapable of real sacrifice. But the men he worked alongside were neither soft nor weak. They were tough, capable, skilled. They simply chose to express their strength differently, not through cruelty or domination, but through confidence so unshakable they didn't need to prove anything. The abundance continued to shock him. The ranch itself sprawled across thousands of acres, with cattle numbering in the thousands. The machinery, tractors and trucks and equipment all functioned perfectly, maintained with almost religious care. Nothing was wasted, yet nothing was scarce. When Heinrich mentioned to Otto that a German farmer might own 20 cows if he was prosperous, Otto translated for Robert, who laughed and said something back. Otto's translation made Heinrich's stomach sink. He says this ranch has over 5,000 head, and it's not even the biggest in the county. 100,000. The number was incomprehensible. The scale of American agriculture, the sheer productive capacity, drove home a truth Heinrich had been trying not to see. Germany couldn't win this war. It was impossible. You couldn't defeat a nation with this much land, this much food, this much industrial power. The numbers didn't lie. While German civilians survived on rationed bread and watery soup, American prisoners ate steak. While German factories struggled with shortages of raw materials, American plants churned out tanks and planes faster than they could be destroyed. The arithmetic of abundance versus scarcity was damning. Over months, Heinrich adapted. He learned English words from the cowboys: post, wire, cattle, saddle. He learned to throw a lasso, though never as well as the Americans who'd been doing it since childhood. He learned to drive cattle across open pastures, to understand the rhythm of ranch life, the way tasks flowed with the seasons and the needs of the land. The other prisoners adapted too. Some remained bitter, clinging to the belief that Germany would somehow achieve final victory. Others, like Heinrich, quietly accepted reality. The war was lost. All that remained was survival and dignity. The cowboys began to trust them. Guards became more relaxed, understanding that escape was pointless. Where would they go? They were thousands of miles from home, in a land so vast that running would mean death by exposure long before reaching anything resembling sanctuary. The ranch itself became their world, and gradually, surprisingly, it became something almost comfortable. Heinrich wrote letters home, carefully worded to pass censorship. He told his mother he was alive, that he was working on a farm, that the Americans treated prisoners fairly. He didn't mention the abundance, knowing she wouldn't believe it. He didn't mention that he ate better in captivity than he had in the German army. He simply reassured her that he was surviving, that he hoped to see her again when the war ended, whenever that might be. The seasons turned. Summer gave way to fall, fall to winter, though winter in Texas was nothing like the killing cold of Russian winters he'd heard other soldiers describe. Spring came again, bringing new calves and the endless work of branding and inoculating. Heinrich found peace in the routine, in the simple dignity of labor. He was no longer a soldier, he was a worker, and somehow, impossibly, that felt like freedom. By June of 1944, Heinrich had been in Texas for nearly a year. He'd learned enough English to communicate without a translator most of the time. He'd earned the quiet respect of the cowboys who worked alongside him. He'd stopped thinking of them as enemies and started thinking of them as simply people. Men who loved their families, who worried about brothers and sons fighting overseas, who worked hard and treated others fairly. Good men, not so different from the farmers and workers he'd known back home. That's why, when he saw Jack Davenport's son fall into the Brazos River, Heinrich didn't hesitate. The boy wasn't American or German. He wasn't enemy or ally. He was just a child drowning in brown water. And Heinrich, who'd spent a year learning that humanity could survive even in captivity, even between enemies, did the only thing that made sense. He jumped in. The war had taken so much. It had turned boys into soldiers, turned nations into enemies, turned the world into a charnel house of industrial death. But it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken the instinct to save a drowning child. It hadn't taken the fundamental truth that some things matter more than flags or uniforms or ideologies. Heinrich Vorbs, prisoner of war, enemy soldier, foreign laborer in a foreign land, had saved a life. And in doing so, he'd proven something the propaganda could never erase, that beneath the surface of all the hatred and violence, humanity endured. Stubborn, undeniable, stronger than any army. That truth, carried in the memory of a small boy coughing up river water while his father wept with relief, would soon force an entire community to confront a question they'd never imagined asking. What do you owe the enemy who saves what you love most? And can an act of courage be enough to bridge the chasm war has torn between people? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours of the rescue, the entire town of Waco knew the story. Not the sanitized version that might appear in a newspaper, but the raw, emotional truth as told by Jack Davenport himself. How he'd looked up from his work and seen his boy, his 7-year-old son Tommy, thrashing in the Brazos. how his heart had stopped, how his legs had gone numb with terror, how he'd known with absolute certainty that he was about to watch his child die, and how a German prisoner, a man whose country was at war with his own, had dropped everything and run toward the water without hesitation, without orders, without thought for his own safety or the consequences he might face. Jack told the story in the feed store. He told it at the gas station. He told it at church that Sunday, standing up during the testimony portion of the service, his voice breaking as he described pulling his soaking, coughing, living son into his arms. His wife Sarah sat beside him, weeping openly, clutching Tommy close. The boy was fine, the doctor had confirmed, bruised, shaken, but fine, because a German soldier named Heinrich Worbs had decided that a child's life mattered more than any war. The story spread like wildfire through dry grass. By Monday morning, it was the only thing anyone discussed. At the diner on Franklin Avenue, where ranchers gathered for morning coffee, the debate began in earnest. Some were moved, awed by the prisoner's courage. Others were cautious, suspicious, unwilling to forget that America was still at war, that boys from McLennan County were still dying in Europe fighting against the very army Heinrich had served. Earl Thompson, whose son had been killed at Anzio just 3 months earlier, stood up in that diner and said what many were thinking. His voice was tight, controlled, heavy with grief that would never fully heal. "I'm glad the Davenport boy is alive. I thank God for that. But let's not forget what we're dealing with here. That man wore a German uniform. He served Hitler. My boy died fighting people just like him. We can't just forget that, because of one good deed." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Then Jack Davenport, sitting in a corner booth with his coffee gone cold, spoke quietly. "Your son died a hero, Earl. Nobody's forgetting that. Nobody's asking you to. But Heinrich Worbs didn't kill your boy. He saved mine. And I've been thinking about it all weekend, thinking about what that means. He could have stayed where he was, could have figured it wasn't his problem, wasn't his fight. Hell, he could have figured he'd get in trouble for leaving his work detail. But he didn't think about any of that. He just saw a child drowning and he jumped in. That tells me something about who he is, not about what uniform he wore 2 years ago, but about who he is right now, right here." Another voice joined in. Pastor William Hendricks from First Baptist, a man whose opinion carried weight in the community. He'd been quiet until now, listening, watching the town struggle with this impossible situation. "I've been praying on this since I heard the story Saturday evening, and I keep coming back to the same scripture. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Now, Tommy Davenport wasn't Heinrich's friend. By all rights, he should have been his enemy's son. But Heinrich was willing to risk his life anyway. That kind of love, that kind of courage, it doesn't come from propaganda or ideology. It comes from something deeper, something that maybe we're supposed to pay attention to. The debate continued. At town hall meetings hastily organized, at church gatherings, in living rooms and front porches across Waco and the surrounding county. The arguments were passionate on both sides. Those opposed pointed to the ongoing war, to the American boys still fighting and dying, to the wives who'd received telegrams and the mothers who'd lost sons. How could they honor a German soldier while the war still raged? Those in favor argued something different, that Heinrich had proven himself in the most fundamental way possible. That if Americans believed in the values they claimed to fight for, freedom, justice, human dignity, then those values had to mean something even when applied to enemies, especially when applied to enemies. Otherwise, what separated America from the regimes it opposed? Sarah Davenport, Tommy's mother, spoke at one town meeting. She was a quiet woman, not given to public speaking, but she stood before her neighbors with steady resolve. "I held my son Saturday evening, and he was alive because of Heinrich Worbis, not because of an American, not because of an ally, but because of a man we're supposed to call our enemy. And I looked at that young man, soaking wet, exhausted, and all I could think was that somebody in Germany loves him the same way I love Tommy. His mother probably prays for him every night, hoping he'll come home safe. And he risked never seeing her again to save my boy." How do we respond to that? With suspicion? With grudging acknowledgement? Or do we do something that shows we meant what we said about human dignity and the worth of every soul? It was Sarah's words that shifted the conversation. Within days, a proposal emerged that shocked even those who'd been arguing in Heinrich's favor. They would build him a house, not after the war, not someday in some theoretical future, now, immediately. They would use their own materials, their own labor, their own time. In the middle of wartime, when resources were rationed and every board, every nail, every hour of work was precious, they would build a home for a German prisoner of war. The proposal was audacious, unprecedented, and legally complicated. Jack Davenport led the effort, but he wasn't alone. Within a week, over 40 families had pledged materials, labor, or both. Ranchers donated lumber from their own supplies. Hardware store owners contributed nails, hinges, and tools. Carpenters and builders volunteered their weekends. The momentum was impossible to ignore. But the legal obstacles were formidable. Could a prisoner of war even own property? American law was murky on the subject. The Geneva Conventions said nothing about it. And there was the larger question, what were they really doing? Were they building a house for a man who would be repatriated to Germany when the war ended? Or were they trying to give Heinrich a reason to stay? That question forced the community to confront what they were truly proposing. They weren't just rewarding a good deed, they were offering a future. They were saying, implicitly but unmistakably, that Heinrich Warbs could have a home here, in Waco, in Texas, in America, that he could become one of them, that the war, when it finally ended, didn't have to mean the end of his connection to this place and these people. A committee formed to navigate the bureaucratic maze. Letters were written to the War Department, to military authorities, to anyone who might have jurisdiction over such an unprecedented situation. The legal questions were thorny. Even if they built the house, could Heinrich live in it while still a prisoner? Could ownership be transferred to a foreign national from an enemy country? What would happen when the war ended and repatriation began? The military's response was cautious, but not dismissive. Camp McLennan's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, met with Jack Davenport and the committee in his office on a sweltering July afternoon. Patterson was a West Point graduate, a career officer who believed deeply in following regulations. But he was also a father of 3, and the story of the rescue had affected him. "Gentlemen and Mrs. Davenport, I understand what you're trying to do here. Respect it. But you're asking me to navigate waters no commanding officer has had to navigate before. Prisoner Warbs is still technically under military custody. He's an enemy combatant, even if he's performed a heroic act. I can't just give him a house and let him settle down like a free man." Jack leaned forward, his hat in his hands. "We're not asking you to do that, sir. Not yet. We're asking you to let us build it, to let the community do something that feels right, that honors what he did. When the war ends, then we figure out the rest. But right now, we need to do this. For ourselves as much as for him." Patterson considered this. His face was thoughtful, weathered by years of military service, but not hardened by it. "If I allow this, and I'm not saying I will, it would have to be clear that ownership remains uncertain until the war's conclusion and repatriation proceedings are completed. Any property would likely need to be held in trust or under some legal arrangement I frankly don't fully understand yet. I'd need clearance from above, and I can't guarantee they'll approve." "We understand that," Pastor Hendricks interjected. "But, sir, with respect, sometimes the right thing to do is complicated. That doesn't make it less right." Patterson almost smiled at that. "Give me 2 weeks. I'll send the inquiries up the chain. In the meantime, if you folks want to gather materials and make plans, I can't stop you from doing that on your own property and your own time. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't denial. The committee took it as permission enough. By early August, less than 2 months after the rescue, construction began. The site was a small plot of land on the edge of the Davenport Ranch, donated by Jack himself. It wasn't large, just 2 acres, but it had a view of rolling hills and a grove of oak trees that provided shade. The house would be modest, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living area, and a porch. Simple but solid, built to last. On the first Saturday of construction, over 60 people showed up. Men in work clothes, women with baskets of food and water, even children running between piles of lumber. It looked less like a construction site and more like a barn raising, those community events that had defined rural life for generations. Neighbors helping neighbors, people coming together to build something that mattered. Heinrich was brought to the site that morning. He stood at the edge of the property, flanked by two guards who looked as uncertain as he felt. He'd been told what was happening, but understanding it intellectually and seeing it with his own eyes were different things. Dozens of Americans, people whose country was at war with his, were building him a house, using their materials, their labor, their Saturday mornings when they could have been doing 1,000 other things. Jack Davenport walked over, a hammer in his hand, sawdust already clinging to his shirt. "You're going to help," he said simply. Not a question. "Oh, statement. You're a farm boy, right? You know how to swing a hammer?" Heinrich nodded, unable to find words in either German or English. "Good. We've got a lot of work to do." And so Heinrich worked alongside the men building his house. It was surreal, disorienting, and deeply moving all at once. He measured boards, he drove nails, he lifted beams alongside ranchers and shopkeepers and men whose sons were fighting in Europe. They didn't talk much, the language barrier and the strangeness of the situation creating a kind of reverent silence. But the work itself spoke volumes. Every board placed, every nail driven was a statement, a choice, a rejection of hatred in favor of something harder to define but impossible to ignore. The women brought lunch at noon. Sandwiches, lemonade, cookies still warm from ovens. They served the workers, including Heinrich, with the same care and generosity. Sarah Davenport handed him a plate and a glass, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she said softly. "For my boy, for Tommy. Thank you." Heinrich's English was still limited, but he managed a response. "He is good child. I'm happy he is safe." Tommy himself was there, darting between adults, his energy boundless, now that the trauma of the river had faded into an exciting story he could tell. He approached Heinrich shyly at one point, standing a few feet away, staring. Then, slowly, he walked closer and held out a cookie. "For you," the boy said. "Mama said I should share." Heinrich took the cookie, his throat tight. "Danke. Thank you." The boy grinned and ran off, and Heinrich stood there holding a chocolate chip cookie, surrounded by people building him a home, and wondered if he'd somehow stumbled into a dream. The construction continued through August and into September. Every weekend, the site filled with volunteers. The frame went up. The roof took shape. Walls were raised and windows installed. It was hot, exhausting work, but nobody complained. There was a sense of purpose to it, a feeling that they were building more than just a house. They were building a symbol, proof that even in wartime, even with all the hatred and violence consuming the world, ordinary people could choose differently. News of the project spread beyond Waco. Newspapers picked up the story. Some editorials praised the community's compassion. Others criticized it as misguided, even treasonous. How dare Texans honor a German soldier while American boys were still dying overseas? The debate raged in print and on radio, but in Waco itself, the work continued. By October of 1944, the house was finished. It stood on its small plot of land, white paint gleaming in the autumn sun, a porch facing west to catch the evening light. Inside, the community had furnished it simply. A bed, a table, chairs, kitchen essentials, everything a man would need to make a life. Heinrich was brought to see the completed house on a Saturday afternoon. The guards removed his handcuffs for the occasion, a small gesture that felt enormous. Jack Davenport handed him a key. "This is yours," Jack said. "When the war ends, when all the legal matters are settled, this will be your home, if you want it, if you choose to stay." Heinrich held the key in his palm. It was small, ordinary, made of brass that caught the light, but it represented something extraordinary. A future, a choice, a place in the world that wasn't defined by war or nationality or the uniforms men had worn. It was simply a home, offered freely, built with generosity, waiting. He looked at Jack, at Sarah standing beside him, at the dozens of people gathered around the house they'd built. He saw Pastor Hendricks, Earl Thompson, who'd lost his son but stood there anyway with complicated grief and grudging respect on his face. the cowboys he'd worked alongside for over a year, the families who'd donated materials and time. He saw America, not the propaganda version, not the enemy in abstract, but the real thing. Messy, complicated, imperfect, and achingly generous. In halting English, Heinrich spoke. "I do not know what to say. I cannot." Jack put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just know it's here. When the time comes, you'll have a choice to make. But whatever you choose, you'll know that you have a home here if you want it." The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. The house stood solid, a promise made tangible, and Heinrich Vorbs, prisoner of war, stood holding a key to a future he'd never imagined possible, surrounded by people who'd decided that one act of courage was enough to bridge even the chasm war had torn between nations. In a world burning with hatred, they'd built something else, something quieter, something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. The key stayed with Lieutenant Colonel Patterson at Camp McLennan. Heinrich couldn't keep it in the barracks. Regulations were clear about personal property, but knowing it existed, knowing the house stood waiting, changed something fundamental in how he moved through the world. Other prisoners noticed. They asked questions in whispered German during evening hours, their voices mixing awe and confusion. Why would the Americans do such a thing? What did it mean? Was it a trick, some elaborate psychological operation designed to break their spirit or twist their loyalty? Heinrich had no answers that satisfied them. All he knew was that a community had built him a home, and that fact sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and warm and impossible to ignore. The months following the house's completion were strange ones. The war ground on in Europe, but its outcome was increasingly clear. By December of 1944, Germany was being crushed from both sides, Soviet forces pushing from the east, Allied armies driving from the west. The propaganda that had once promised final victory had gone silent, replaced by grim. Reports of strategic withdrawals and heroic last stands, the language of a nation preparing for defeat. In Texas, life continued with its steady rhythms. Fences still needed mending, cattle still needed tending. Heinrich worked alongside the cowboys, his English now fluent enough for real conversations, for jokes and stories shared during water breaks. The guards had become almost friendly, understanding that these prisoners posed no threat, that escape was both pointless and undesired. Where would they go? This land, these people, had become more familiar than the Germany they'd left years ago. Jack Davenport's son, Tommy, had adopted Heinrich in the way only children can, without reservation or complication. He would run up when the work truck arrived, chattering about school or fishing or the new calf that had been born. Heinrich would listen, his weathered face softening into something approaching peace. He'd had a younger brother back in Germany, lost to pneumonia before the war. Tommy filled that empty space, at least partially, at least enough to make the ache bearable. Spring came early in 1945. Bluebonnets carpeted the fields in waves of purple. The air smelled of possibility and new grass. And then, in early May, the news everyone had been expecting finally arrived. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The announcement brought mixed emotions to Camp McLennan. Relief that the killing had stopped. Anxiety about what came next. Repatriation would begin soon. The process of returning thousands of prisoners to a homeland most of them barely recognized anymore. Some prisoners were eager to go home, desperate to find out if their families had survived. Others were terrified, knowing they were returning to a country in ruins, occupied by foreign armies, its future uncertain. Heinrich fell somewhere between those extremes. He wanted to see his mother, to know if she'd survived the bombing raids and the collapse. But the thought of leaving Texas, of leaving the house that stood waiting, of leaving people who'd shown him more kindness than he'd known in years, that thought created a different kind of pain. The repatriation process was slow, bureaucratic, complicated by the sheer number of prisoners and the devastation in Europe. It wasn't until August of 1945, 3 months after the war's end, that Heinrich's group was scheduled for transport. The night before he left, Jack Davenport came to the camp. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, who'd bent more regulations in the past year than he cared to admit, allowed them a private conversation in his office. Jack brought the key. He placed it on the desk between them. "This is still yours," he said quietly. "The legal folks say once you're repatriated, once you're officially a free man and no longer a POW, you can apply for immigration. It might take time, might take years with all the changes happening, but the house will be here. We'll maintain it. And if you want to come back, we'll help you do it." Heinrich picked up the key, turned it over in his fingers. His English was good now, good enough to express what he needed to say. "In Germany, I learned that some people are evil, that hate can spread like disease. But here, I learned something else. That goodness can spread too. That one act of kindness can change everything. You changed me, Jack. Your family, your town, you showed me what humanity can be. I don't know if I can come back. I don't know what I'll find at home, what obligations I'll have, what will be possible. But I want you to know that this, all of this, it matters. More than you can know." Jack's eyes were bright with emotion he didn't try to hide. "You saved my boy. I'll never forget that. None of us will." They shook hands, and in that grip was everything words couldn't capture. Gratitude, respect, friendship born from the strangest circumstances, forged in a moment of crisis and strengthened by a community's extraordinary choice. The train that carried Heinrich and hundreds of other prisoners east left from Waco Station on an August morning when the heat was already oppressive. Families had gathered to see them off, not all of them, but enough that it meant something. Sarah Davenport was there with Tommy. The boy had made Heinrich a card, crayon drawings of a house and a stick figure labeled Heinrich and "Come Back," written in careful letters. Heinrich folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. The journey back to Germany took weeks, first by train to the East Coast, then by ship across the Atlantic, those same waters he'd crossed in fear 2 years earlier. But the fear was different now. Then he'd feared what America would do to him. Now he feared what he'd find in Germany. The ship docked at Bremerhaven in September of 1945. What Heinrich saw when he stepped onto German soil stopped him cold. The port city was rubble. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened by bombing raids. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their walls shattered, their roofs gone. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that hung loose on frames wasted by hunger. This was home. This was what remained. The journey to Hanover took days, traveling through a landscape of devastation. Every city bore the scars of war. Hamburg was a wasteland of burned-out buildings. Bremen was hollow. The countryside fared better, but even there, destruction marked the land. Bridges were destroyed. Railways were damaged. The efficient, orderly Germany of his youth had become a broken, occupied nation struggling to survive. His mother had survived. That miracle kept him moving forward when everything else felt impossible. She'd been living in the basement of their bombed-out farmhouse, subsisting on black bread and whatever vegetables she could grow in the ruined garden. When Heinrich walked up the dirt road to what remained of home, she collapsed into his arms, weeping so hard her whole body shook. He was 30 pounds heavier than when he'd left Germany, healthy and strong from Texas food and ranch work. She was skeletal, aged 20 years in the 5 he'd been gone. The contrast was devastating. While he'd eaten steak and learned to rope cattle, she'd survived on rations that barely sustained life. The guilt was crushing. But so was the realization that if he'd been here, he likely would have died. Either in the final desperate battles of the war, or in the chaos of collapse, or simply from the starvation and disease that stalked post-war Germany. Texas had saved his life in more ways than one. Over the following months, Heinrich helped his mother rebuild. Not the house that would take years and resources they didn't have, but life, small and precarious as it was. He found work with the occupation authorities, his English making him valuable as a translator and liaison. The Americans controlling their sector treated Germans firmly but fairly, following the same principles of decency Heinrich had experienced in Texas. The Russians to the east were a different story, their occupation brutal and vengeful. Geography had saved his family again. Hanover sat in the British sector, soon to be transferred to American control. The letters from Texas began arriving in early 1946, Jack Davenport wrote, updating Heinrich on the ranch, on Tommy's progress in school, on the house that still stood waiting. Sarah sent recipes and news from church. Pastor Hendrick sent scripture and encouragement. The Waco community hadn't forgotten him. The war was over, but their commitment wasn't. Heinrich wrote back, describing the devastation, the difficulty of rebuilding, the slow process of a nation trying to find its footing after total defeat. He didn't mention the house, didn't acknowledge the standing invitation because he didn't know how to. His mother needed him. Germany needed him. The guilt of having survived, of having eaten well while his countrymen starved, demanded some kind of penance. But the key, that brass key Jack had given him, he kept it, carried it in his pocket like a talisman, a reminder that somewhere across an ocean a different future waited. The decision crystallized slowly over 2 years. By 1948, Germany was stabilizing. The Marshall Plan was pouring American aid into reconstruction. His mother's health had improved, the farm had been partially rebuilt, and his younger sister had returned from where she'd been evacuated during the war. She had a husband now, a man who'd lost his legs at Stalingrad, but had survived. They could manage the farm. His mother, while she'd never say it directly, made it clear she'd be fine. She'd survived worse than his absence. That summer, Heinrich applied for immigration to the United States. The process was complicated, but his POW record was impeccable. He had documentation from Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, letters of support from Jack Davenport and half the town of Waco, and proof of property waiting for him in Texas. The house, held in trust by the community, would serve as evidence he wouldn't become a burden on the American government. The approval came in January of 1949. By March, Heinrich Warbs was on a ship bound for America, not as a prisoner this time, but as a free man, an immigrant, someone choosing a future rather than being forced into one. Jack Davenport met him at the port of Houston. They'd both aged, the years visible in new lines and gray hair. But the handshake was the same, firm and warm and full of meaning. "Welcome home," Jack said simply. They drove to Waco, 5 hours through Texas landscape that looked exactly as Heinrich remembered. Wide skies, endless horizons, the confidence of a nation that had won the war and was building the peace. When they turned onto the dirt road leading to the house, Heinrich's chest tightened. It stood exactly as he remembered, white paint fresh, porch solid. The oak trees had grown, their shade deeper. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as the truck stopped, the front door opened. Sarah stood there, and Tommy, now 11 years old and almost unrecognizable in his growth, and behind them, dozens of people from the community. They'd prepared a welcome-home meal, had spent the morning making the house ready, had gathered to witness this impossible conclusion to a story that had begun 5 years earlier in a swollen river. Heinrich stepped out of the truck, his legs unsteady. He walked to the porch, to the door, to the threshold of a house built by former enemies who'd become something far more complicated and beautiful. Family, community, home. That night, sitting on the porch as the sun set and painted the sky in impossible colors, Heinrich told the gathered crowd about Germany, about the devastation, about the difficult years of rebuilding, about the people struggling to create something new from the ruins of something terrible. And he told them what their kindness had meant, not just to him, but to the other prisoners who'd heard the story, because the story had spread. Through Camp McLennan and beyond, through the network of nearly 50,000 German POWs who'd been held in Texas during the war. They'd all heard about the house in Waco, about the community that had responded to one good deed with overwhelming generosity. And when those men returned to Germany, they carried that story with them. They told their families, their neighbors, their communities about Americans who'd chosen mercy over vengeance, who'd built bridges instead of walls. In the years that followed, dozens of former POWs returned to America, seeking the abundance and opportunity they'd glimpsed during captivity. They became farmers, engineers, teachers, businessmen. They married American women, raised American children, and became living connections between former enemy nations. The reconciliation between Germany and the United States, so crucial to post-war stability, was built partially on treaties and aid packages. But it was also built on thousands of personal connections, on stories of decency that undermined years of propaganda. Heinrich Vorbs lived in that house for 43 years. He married a German immigrant he met in Houston, a woman named Greta, who'd lost her entire family in the bombing of Dresden. They had 3 children, all born in Texas, all raised on stories of how their father's courage had been met with extraordinary kindness. Heinrich worked as a translator, then as a teacher of German language at Baylor University. He became a citizen in 1954. He voted in every election afterward, a right he never took for granted. Tommy Davenport, the boy pulled from the river, grew up to become a teacher himself. He named his firstborn son Heinrich, a gesture that made the old German weep with gratitude. The two families, Davenport and Vorbs, became intertwined over decades, sharing holidays and celebrations, bound by that day in June 1944, when the world might have ended, but didn't. The house became something of a legend in Waco. People would drive by to see it, to point it out to visitors as proof of what their community had done. It stood as a reminder that even in the darkest times, ordinary people could choose extraordinary kindness. That one act of courage could be answered with overwhelming generosity. That the walls war builds between people aren't permanent if we choose to tear them down. Heinrich Vorbs died in 1992 at 74 years old. His funeral filled First Baptist Church to capacity. Cowboys who'd worked alongside him 50 years earlier, now old men themselves, came to pay respects. Former students came, speaking of his patience and his stories of 2 worlds. Tommy Davenport, 64 years old, gave the eulogy. He spoke of a German soldier who'd saved a drowning boy, and a community that had responded by proving that humanity's capacity for good could match its capacity for violence. The house still stands today, now owned by Heinrich's granddaughter. Inside, on the mantel above the fireplace, sits a framed photograph from 1949. It shows Heinrich standing on the porch, Jack Davenport beside him, both men smiling, the house gleaming white behind them. Next to the photograph is a small brass key on a chain, and a card made by a 7-year-old boy with crayon drawings and the words, "Come back," written in careful letters. These artifacts tell a story that transcends their specific details. They speak to a truth that war tries to erase but can never quite destroy, that we are all ultimately human. That courage can come from anywhere, even from someone we've been taught to call enemy. And that when we choose to respond to that courage with kindness rather than suspicion, with generosity rather than calculation, we create something that outlasts the conflicts that divided us. In a world that had burned itself nearly to ash, a small community in Texas had built a house, not as shelter alone, but as a statement, as proof, as a promise that even when everything tells us to hate, we can choose differently. One German prisoner, one drowning child, one impossible decision answered by another impossible decision. And from that, a legacy that whispers across generations. There is always another way if we're brave enough to take it.